Okay, good afternoon. We had a successful Q&A last Saturday, and so I thought I would give it another try. Um, and the fir- Good afternoon. Now I can see myself um, on the Q&A, and I hope there seems to be a little delay. But anyway, first thing I'd like to do is see if the chat is working. So if anyone has come on to this uh, live feed at this point, hi Shea, how are you? Nice to see you. Okay, that's very helpful because now I can see that my chat is working properly. Um, and now I can see how I'm going to see the chat also. Um, and so uh, the other day in our live group, uh, which we have at a local pizza restaurant, we had a conversation about uh, arranged and love marriages and whether those are good, bad, or indifferent. Hello, Jerome. Nice to see you. Uh, or at least I'm seeing your avatar. Uh, let's see. Shea says the chat shows in the video feed. Yes, that is intentional. And the reason it is intentional is because when the live feed is over, I think this is only my second time, so I'm working out, and I don't think I need this headset anymore. But I'm working out the technology still, and on the first one, the live chat was not available in the video, but I think this will allow the chat to be on the video after we're finished. And so I can see your points and your responses. Great. We'll keep going. Okay, it's a little disconcerting because in my system I am seeing myself in real time, but then when I see it on YouTube on the chat part, I am seeing a delay of a few seconds. And it seems that we have 7 people watching now, so that's a great start. And so let's get right into it. I put up our conversation from Monday night in a video just a few minutes ago. And one of the issues we addressed is whether arranged marriages are a good thing. And my friend Des was talking about a television program she's been watching in which people meet for the first time and get married right away. Hi, hi Arcadian Wings. Nice to see you as well. Yeah, it's great to have you here. So I was talking about arranged marriages, and I have had a lot of experience in India, so I've seen a lot of people who've been married through arranged marriages. And in my experience, they work just as well, if not better, than love marriages. And there are probably a lot of reasons for that. But I think the fundamental one is that when we go into a love marriage, that very often that's because the anima has seized us, or the animus in the case of women, and that's our deep unconscious saying, yes, that's the woman for me, or yes, that's the man for me. And so we talk about the honeymoon phase of a marriage, and the issue is that when the honeymoon is over, you wake up one fine day, maybe 4 to 6 weeks after you're married, and you realize that you really don't know this other person at all, and you certainly didn't know his or her bad habits, and now what? And the answer is that we need to learn how to learn from our partner. I think that that's basically what I'm trying to say here. And we are not complete. Each individual is not complete. And we're not complete because our psyche works on the principle of opposites. Our psychic energy, the psychic energy itself operates on the principle of opposites. And so without tension between the opposites, nothing happens. We just stay as inert as stones. But when we marry, we right away have an opposite, namely usually the opposite sex. But there's thousands of potential opposites. It's not necessarily, it really, gender is only one of the opposites. And so this is a very fundamental idea in Jungian psychology, which is that without those opposites, nothing happens. But today, as we teach children how to get married, we don't teach them that this other person that you're going to marry isn't going to see things the way you do. I mean, we have this joke that we've said a couple of times, which is, if a man speaks in the woods and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the answer to that question is yes, he is, because it's the wrongness that creates the opposites, the psychic energy. And there's always two sides to every story. And so when your wife or your husband says you're wrong about something, it only says that they see something from a different point of view. And a successful marriage is learning how that works, how that interference with your clear-eyed view of how everything should be just so, and the problem is that your partner doesn't see it that way. And very often that's true. And so a marriage is about reaching what Dr. Jung would call the conjunctio, the conjunction. It's the mixture of the two psyches in some third thing that holds together as a marriage. I hope I'm being clear about this, but in any case, the point is, a love marriage only has a short period of time. That's the honeymoon period, and then you're really with a stranger too, even if you're not in an arranged marriage. And so the advantage that people who do follow the arranged marriage custom have is that they know that they don't know the other person, and they know that they're going to have to make compromises and work out what the best thing to do for the couple is. And so they seem to have a advantage in marriage to me. I mean, yes, it's nice to have that magical moment of the exchange that's the honeymoon period and the love period before getting married. That's awfully nice, and it's a great feeling, but in the end it doesn't get you very much. And often, parents have a better idea of what type of person you might be better with, in India, I suppose your parents may have a reason why they want you to be married into a certain family, because that certain family has a kind of prestige that you want for your family, and vice versa. Or there may be a dowry involved in in even in Old England, there were dowries where I think in Shakespeare in Love, Lord Wessex says, "Your father has bought me for you," which meant that the father of the bride had paid a dowry so that Lord Wessex would marry his daughter, if I understand this. Let's see. Do I think psychological types have a role in a love marriage? Surely they do. They have a real role in practically everything. And so if you're familiar with the Myers-Briggs type indicator, you might say that, well, as I understand it, it's best if there's one or two of the types that are different. That's a good question, Jerome. I appreciate that one very much. There ought to be one or two of the types different. And so let me just go through the 4 spectra of psychological types that are included in the MBTI. Actually, the 4th one wasn't developed by Dr. Jung himself, but it's a standard part of the MBTI. And so the way that works is you're either introverted or extroverted. And these are my simple ways of thinking of these things. It's sort of an easy way to think of them. An introverted person goes to a party and really prefers to be off in the side of the room talking to one person or 2 persons, whereas an extroverted person likes to be in a big group, yucking it up, telling jokes, ha ha ha, everything's like that. And so that's one difference. An introverted person would rather stay at home and read a book or watch television. An extroverted person would rather be out at a bar or at a dance or something, or at a movie theater with a lot of people around. Then there's the sensing and intuitive people. Sensing people tend to get all the details. And so a sensing person, you can show them 1,000 trees and they won't necessarily believe there's a forest there. Whereas an intuitive person, you can show them 3 trees and they assume there's a forest there. There's a big difference. And then the next layer is thinking and feeling. And a thinking person is logic. It's all logos, rational. Everything has to be rational and so on. And a feeling person tends to be more emotional and decide things based on what feels right. And so those are the 3 spectra that were developed by Dr. Jung. The 4th one is judging and perceiving. And the way I explain that is a perceiving person goes to the grocery store to buy food, and and so this includes me, and so I happen to know, and so he goes up and down the aisles and he picks food off the shelves and fills his cart and checks out. A judging person makes a list, and if they're extremely judging, they will make a very precise list. They will go to the grocery store and buy things only from that list and fill their cart, pay for their food, and go home. Both types eat, but it's just a different way of thinking about things. And so in a marriage, if you have 3 of these things the same, 2 or 3 of these things the same, you're going to be better served than if they're all different. If they're all different, you're always going to be in conflict. And if they're all the same, it's going to be the dullest relationship on the planet. And so you're better off having at least 1 or 2 differences. In my personal case, my wife is a judging person and I'm a perceiving person. And so She wants to have everything precise and what time are we going to leave, that sort of thing. And I don't particularly worry about such details. It doesn't bother me because I know that I'll leave at some point, something like that. But, you know, when we go to the grocery store together, she gets the food that she knows we need to survive, and I buy the ice cream. That's the way it works. Yeah, psychological types are very important for both types of marriage and for the long term. And knowing about them is also extremely valuable because, you know, often my wife and I will have some sort of conflict, and it's almost always over this judging, perceiving way of looking at the world. And so now, by this time, and for the last 30 years, we've always said, oh, that's very judging of you, or that's very perceiving of you. and that seems to work as a way to relax the tension. But I wanted to try to explain a little bit more about this psychic energy idea and the opposites. So all opposites have energy that goes between them, and if that's not there, nothing happens. And so an example, Dr. Jung's favorite example is a waterfall, where there's up and down, and the water goes from up to down. It never goes from down to up. And so in the middle of that waterfall, you can put a generator, and that will generate electricity. And so there's energy going between the two. This is obviously metaphorical. But in that case of opposites, the energy only flows in one direction. But there is a compensating type of energy, which is the heat of the sun, which causes the water, once it gets down in the lower pool, to evaporate and go back up into the sky, into clouds, then rain back down at the source of the waterfall, and then the water moves down the river and over the falls once again. And so that's a complete cycle of energy. So all these energies are not necessarily just pedantically left and right, and you know, not like that. It's not that easy. It's very complicated, and we have thousands of opposites within our psyche. And this is why Dr. Jung got into alchemy, because in our psyches, we have a lot of stuff rolling around, things that we don't even remember. I know just this morning I was thinking about something that happened 40 years ago, and I had no particular reason to think of that, except it came to my mind. And so you never know what's going to come up in your mind. And it's called for certain reasons. You know, something might happen, you might hear an old song on the radio, or somebody says something on television, or what have you, and something that's very old in your psyche will come up. And, you know, it's often useful. And so anyway, thank you for the question. Let's see. Arcadian Wings asks, is it possible our types evolve through time, or is our true self one specific type? I do think that they evolve through time to a certain degree, but you know, there's a book here in the U.S. Called People, Types, and Tiger Stripes, and that's about the MBTI and about this type issue. And basically it's saying that this is our fundamental way that we want to be in life. And I used to As a lot of my followers already know, I spent 23 years in the Marine Corps. And in the Marine Corps, one of the things we learned at the National War College, as a matter of fact, and actually at all the senior schools that I attended, we had one day devoted to the MBTI, believe it or not. The U.S. military thinks that the Myers-Briggs type indicator is extremely important. And so even reserve officers, I was a reserve officer for 20 years, and so I would only be on active duty for 10 business days a year. But one of those 10 days, so 10% of the time, was devoted to the MBTI in Marine Corps Command and Staff College, in the Naval War College, the National War College, and the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. So I went to the reserve course in all those places, and in every one of them, they spent one of the 10 days teaching us the MBTI. And one of the interesting facts that came out of that teaching was that 95% of all admirals and generals in the military are STJ. They're sensing, they're thinking, and they're judging. And they may be introverted or extroverted, but they anyway are STJ. Now, for me, I'm INTP, so I'm not ideally suited to be a major general in the Marine Corps. But what I found was that on days that I wore my uniform, I could put the type on with my uniform. So in other words, when I would be going on a military exercise of some sort, I just changed. I became an STJ person for that purpose. But I always settle back to NTP. And so I don't think you're every day stuck with being any particular type. It's useful to know that these types exist so that you know what your weaknesses are. And so my weakness has always been not getting the details. I don't get enough details very often. But in the Marine Corps, I was trained to get all the necessary details to prepare for a mission or something like that. And we have a definite process that calls for the collection of those details. And so, a Marine officer wouldn't necessarily miss the necessary details for a mission because he's trained to go get them and to know what he needs to know. So I think that you can. So it's useful to know what the opposite is. So in my case, I know I have a weakness in getting details, and so I consciously do it where I have to do it. For example, preparing for this live feed, I had to get the details of how to set up the ticker that's going across the bottom of the screen, and how to put the questions for the chat, how to put the chat on the screen so that everybody can see it, that sort of thing. And so I worked very hard to get those details and learn how to do that. If I was purely intuitive and didn't think that was important, I would just, be like somebody who just comes in and says, well, why isn't it working? We've seen a few people like that lately. And so the other issue for senior officers is lacking an F component, a feeling component. And so they tend to be not as attuned to the needs, let's say, of the civilian population. And obviously that can cause problems in the military and lots of other places. And traditionally, men were on the thinking side and women were on the feeling side. And when they first started doing the MBTI, it was working out that way. But nowadays, when they test the MBTI, as I understand it, or even for the last 30 years, because my training was 30 years ago, men and women typically fall down about 50-50 on the thinking and feeling. And so it's very useful for me as a thinking person to know that I have to be conscious of other people's feelings and how what I do may impact someone else. Now, in the military, they teach us with the MBTI a graphic, and I'll just show it to you. It's SNTF. So it's like this. So in the military, they teach us to have a to have a team where first you have an S person who is, let's see here, okay. So you have an S person, and that person's getting all the details. Then the intuitive person figures out what the details mean, and then the thinking person makes the plan around what the details mean. That's here. And then there has to be a feeling person to say, well, okay, if you do this, this is how it's going to impact people's lives. And so they want you to do this Zorro approach to any mission planning in the military, and it's very helpful to know that you have to consciously know what your team members are capable of doing and what they're going to be best at. So that's how that works. Is our true self one specific type? I think pretty much. I mean, I haven't noticed any big change in myself, certainly for 30 to 40 years probably. I've always been very intuitive. I've tested on the MBTI in the 99th percentile on the intuition scale. And so, and I haven't seen that changing. I mean, I can consciously get detail, but I gave up practicing law in 1979 after only 5 years because I literally detested it. I went to law school and I thought that was an interesting academic challenge and I was enjoying it. I liked going to school very much. I spent 10 years in higher education between college, law school, business school, and then a year of professional training in Mandarin Chinese. And so I liked all that schooling experience very much. And I particularly liked law school. But once I got out to practice law, I didn't like that at all because it's always dealing with other people's hardships. And so I do from time to time get forced to do legal work, and I just have always detested it. But I had no clue that that's what was going to happen when I went to law school. So anyway, so any other questions? Let's see, how many people? We still have 7 people watching, so there must be a few other people. We don't have to stay on the arranged marriage topic at all, and so I'm just making myself available to answer questions that folks have about Dr. Jung's work. Jerome, I wonder if you'd tell us something about your experience of getting into Jungian psychology. You and I have been having some conversation offline here, and you mentioned that you've been reading it for 40 years, which is about a decade longer than me. So I'm just curious how you might have gotten started on that. And I'd be interested in other people's experiences as well, if you're willing to share. You don't have to share, but I'm just saying that might be a useful way to provoke some conversation here. Let's see. Okay. So it's looking like a weekday. I have a question about the tarot. Is it necessary? Okay, this is Arcadian Wings asking, I have a question about the tarot. Is it necessary for the questioner to touch the cards before the spread? You don't have to turn. You don't have to turn to this topic now if you don't want, if it doesn't fit. Well, I think the tarot is important because it's a way of opening up access to the unconscious, and it's absolutely not necessary for the questioner to touch the cards. That's really an affectation, but I do it when I'm in the presence of a questioner, mainly in order to sort of set the mood, more than anything else. But other than that, it's not necessary to touch the cards. But the reason I'm such a believer in the tarot is because I know that when things are said during a reading, it will connect to hooks that are in your deep unconscious. Lady Shea says, I heard someone once say Jung saw a person as a four-dimensional being, time as well as space. Is this correct? Anything you can expand on that? I would guess that he saw people as a many more dimensional being than four dimensions. If he answered four dimensions to someone, it's probably because he didn't want to overwhelm them. But the reality is that we live on many, many dimensions. Even just our different relationships with different people are a different dimension. And we can't predict, they're really different universes. Let me see if I can explain my beef with scientists. My favorite people to pick on are Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson. And the reason is that 30 years ago, when Carl Sagan did the Cosmos series, the original one, he was railing against newspapers because there were 3,000 columns around the world on astrology, but none on astronomy, and he was really angry about that. And he really was quite angry about it all of his life. I mean, you can, here on YouTube, you can look up Carl Sagan's last interview, for example, and he's railing against fairy tales and stories about witchcraft. He says it's not scientific, blah, blah, blah. And Neil deGrasse Tyson was Carl Sagan's student, and one time I heard him talking about the moment that he was outside Carl Sagan's door at Cornell University for the first time, and he knew he was going to go in the door, and he was so excited about it. Okay. Well, the problem with science and with statistics, and I went to a business school that was 15 courses in statistics by different names, actually. The problem is that it turns everything into black and white, to rationality. And so just imagine you're Neil deGrasse Tyson and you're very impressed by Carl Sagan, and now you're going to finally meet him, and you knock on the door very worried about whether you'll come across well to him and so on. And then you have your first meeting and you start to describe it. Well, in the end, you can describe the event fairly simply like that, but you can never explain the feeling you had, or the feeling that Sagan had, or the feeling that passed between you. And that's all the important color. So I think of rational thought, scientific thought, as being black and white, but we have all the color. And so at one point on the Archetype in Action website, I wrote an article, which you can find there, called Carl Sagan, it might be called Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson missed an entire universe. But I got reflecting on that, and really they missed billions of universes, because all of our psyches are a universe unto themselves, and none of us could possibly describe the contents of our psyches to another person. And so we each have an entire universe within our psyche, in addition to the black and white universe that the astronomers see. So very interesting synchronicity that you saw that interview 2 days ago. Very interesting. So in any case, and ironically, the last book that Sagan wrote was a book that was railing against goblins and witches. I mean, the psyche part of ourselves was really a bugaboo for Carl Sagan, and you can see it throughout the last 20 years of his life. He was great as long as he could talk about something that was black and white and he could look at it through a telescope. But you start talking about the psyche, and he just couldn't cope with it. And the question is, hello, Mr. Aslanov. Thank you for coming. The problem is science can't, or at least the scientific method, let's say, can't really describe what's in the psyche. Even Dr. Jung himself was troubled by this, because throughout his life, Dr. Jung tried to make things sound like he was a very scientific man, and indeed he was in terms of his way of thinking. But in terms of explaining what the psyche is, it's not possible to do it by measuring and so on. In other words, okay, my psyche is operating somewhere here in my head and partially in my body somewhere. Yeah, it is there. And yeah, you can hook up electrodes to my head and you can see some part of my brain light up when I talk about chocolate cake or the first time I had a lover or what have you. They'll all light up differently. But beyond that, it can't be explained. And so, there's no way for science to appreciate those dimensions. Let's see. Imagine, Lady Shea says, I've been imagining having visions of the self as a fourth dimensional being through time, maybe even in 3 dimensions of time, where the sense of time moving is only the effect of consciousness, ego. Um, yeah, I think that Dr. Jung would be sympathetic to that. I know we talk a lot about the pleroma and how time-space is only one dimension of it, and it's really all in the pleroma. And if you blew it all away, it would all start again, um, maybe with a little bit different patina. But I don't think that 4 dimensions covers it. I mean, there are just too many dimensions to even talk about, and you can, in terms of the mind, or the psyche. Okay, you can talk about the chemicals that are running around in the brain, but that in no way will find, let's say, this 40-year-old memory that came to my mind this morning. Where was that? Nobody could tell you where that was. And, meanwhile, your unconscious is doing so many other things all the time. It's making your heart beat 72 times a minute, and your lungs breathe 12 times a minute, and it's causing your cells to be regenerated constantly. They say that we have a new body every 7 years entirely. We just switch over the contents every 7 years. So where is the psyche in that? And so we have a long way to go. I mean, I've been reading today even where just in the basics of what we know about the psyche, we have lots and lots of investigation that's necessary before we know ourselves truly. I mean, since Greek times, we've been saying "know thyself." In fact, in the symbol of my college is the phrase "know thyself," and that was an old Greek idea. But we really don't know much about ourselves and how we really operate. Arcadian Wing says, I get triggered when I listen to people like Sagan because they have this charisma that makes them come across naturally convincing, but they should be more humble when talking about the psyche. I agree entirely, and I've tried on numerous occasions to get Neil deGrasse Tyson's attention, and he doesn't want to have any part of it because he knows he has he can't argue the points. And there's I'll put on the video for this session. I'll index it in a little right after we finish, and then I'll find the link to the article I did about Sagan and Tyson. But among other things, I put a YouTube clip from Tyson where he's describing things about black holes and that sort of thing. And he's using the same terminology that someone describing the tarot would use, or a witch or a magician would use. But he doesn't see that. He doesn't understand that that's what he's doing. and so somehow this issue between pure scientific method per se and psychological understanding needs to be engaged. Jerome says, I think knowledge of MBTI, it's one of the keys for all us in understanding each other and being able to communicate not only with your spouse, but all other people you encounter. Absolutely, I agree entirely. And I did teach and use MBTI in leadership development. And as you said, you can learn to mimic and enter into the other types domains to have meaningful communications and outcomes. So, Jerome, you would find my wife very boring because she's an INTJ too. But I've had so many experiences, and the one other thing that I found, I mean, ever since I learned about the MBTI, and this is basically my first introduction to Jungian psychology in August of 1987. Um, Ever since then, I've been using it constantly, and it took me a long time to get it. Um, I was teaching finance at the University of Maryland Graduate School, and one of my colleagues was a beautiful um, red-haired uh, PhD woman, brand new PhD. She was about 30 at the time, and she was gorgeous. And she sat down and had lunch with me one day and started to talk about the MBTI. And I was trying to understand what she was talking about. And for 2 weeks, we had lunches every day. And I just kept asking her question after question after question. And I finally got it, but it took a long while. And then very shortly after that, I went to Marine Corps Command and Staff College and had the formal MBTI one-day course. And ever since then, I've always found uh, the utility of it very great. The other thing that I think is important, I'm a little bit leery about neurolinguistic programming, so-called NLP, um, because it uses a few ideas that I think are a little bit uh, shaky, that shouldn't be used from a moral point of view. But one that I've always found very useful is the idea of mirroring. And so uh, when I'm in a face-to-face meeting with someone, I I used to consciously mirror. So if somebody would go like this, then I would go like this. So I would mirror them if I was facing them. And so my hand would look like it was a mirror image of their hand, and so on. And whatever it was that they were doing, I would try to mirror. And I used to do it consciously. Now I just do it. I do it unconsciously. But I find that it's a very good way to make a connection with the deeper self of the people I'm talking to. Um, and okay, yeah, Arcadia Wiggs says that's why scientists claim nobody understands quantum physics. Um, it is the psyche. Yeah, I think there's a big element of that, element of truth in that. And the fascinating thing is what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, where they've been able, up to I think about 16 now, if something at the atomic level it's either black or white, let's say, the other thing will always be white. And so if you have two parts of this atom, and one of them is in Europe and one of them is in North Carolina, and the person in Europe opens the box with the black in it, he'll see the black, but it'll always be white on the American side of the equation, and that's always true in quantum physics. But they can't explain it yet. But they can do it, and if they can do it, I think to 16 iterations somehow. I'm not exactly sure how this all works, but I'm not that kind of a scientist. Quantum entanglement, right? Quite right. And so I'm not exactly sure how it works, since I'm not a physicist. And of course, they're not sure how it works either, but they can explain it better than I can. But it always does work. And if they can do it in something like 100 iterations, then they can have a supercomputer that fits in your wristwatch, something like that. I mean, those are the orders of magnitudes they're talking about. And so it's a very powerful idea if you can get it to work for you. But right now, it's a monumental undertaking for them to get that. But anyway, quantum entanglement. So, I mean, in theory, you could have it between the Earth and Mars and have instantaneous communication that way. And it wouldn't be bounded by the speed of light. And, I think that that's a very interesting idea, and science is now finding that things do go faster than the speed of light because, among other things, the universe itself, I think they're now saying that the universe is 46 billion light years across, and from the Big Bang, except the Big Bang was 13.7 billion years ago. So if you multiply that by 2 so that the Big Bang was at the center of that thing, you would only get up to 27.4 light years, even if for the diameter of the universe, even if you went at the speed of light. And so how did the universe get to be 46 billion light years across? No idea. I have no idea. And I don't think they really do. Yeah, I agree with you, Jerome, about NLP being a kind of mirroring, pacing, matching. And those things I did do, but NLP I think is a fairly broad topic. It's not only that, and I think that there are some techniques in NLP which are rather manipulative. Of course, there are things in psychology that can cause manipulation. Let me talk about the anatomy of dependence for a moment. Anatomy of dependence. There's a book called that by a man named Doi, a Japanese man, D-O-I, Doi. And basically, and Doi is describing the Japanese psyche, and what he said, first he explains that Japanese children under age 5 are allowed to be basically wild animals. They're not in any way disciplined. And so if you're in a public place in Japan, it's very common to see children under 5 who are acting out very strongly. And but then when they're 5, then they enter the Japanese school system, which is extremely rigid, and every mother wants their child to go to Tokyo University, Todai so-called. And so if you're going to get into Tokyo University, you have to have a programming of your education from kindergarten. And so the tradition is you let your child do anything they want until they're 5, and then benkyo, benkyo, benkyo. You force the benkyo means study. So mom will just stand over you with a switch and say benkyo, 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 and the kids in great fear do what mom tells them. And I don't know how healthy it is, but it makes for very strong study habits among Japanese. But what Doi was saying in his book was that makes the child dependent upon the mother, and so the child has no choice. And so the way it can work is, for example, in a conversation where where if people tell you all about themselves, let's say, and I'm telling you all about myself, so I'm becoming dependent upon you, but that's the way it works. That if someone tells you all about themselves, as they're doing that, it's a way they become dependent upon your interaction. And if you have lots of those interactions, as you do in a marriage, let's say, then you become dependent upon one another. And so that's another idea. It's not strictly in Jungian psychology, but it's an interesting idea. And we still seem to have 7 folks watching, so if anyone else has a question about Jungian psychology, I'd love to answer it. But thank you all for coming by. I was actually, I'm still experimenting on what day of week and what time of day would be best. And I'm keeping in mind that I know that one of the viewers here is in Netherlands and another in Sweden, and I have other viewers who are from California, and so there's a very wide time zone issue across the world in terms of communicating live with folks. But if you have thoughts about when I should try to do question and answer periods, I would love to have your comments either on this live chat page or on the video once it goes live, which it will shortly after we finish, to see if we can figure out the time that we would reach the most people and get the best questions and the most questions. It turned out, in terms of the popularity of the page, that YouTube's very good about giving me the statistics about who watch it, or not who, but how much certain videos are watched. And invariably, since the beginning of this channel, the very first video I did, which I didn't think was particularly wonderful, but I did a video where I just talked about individuation for 45 minutes. And invariably, ever since I put that up on YouTube in June of 2016, that's been the most popular video on the website. So I normally get the last 28-day period, so it's the last 4 weeks, and in this last 28-day period, that video has had 5,000 minutes of viewing, which is about 10%, is it 10? Yeah, about 10% of all the viewing for that period of time. But the Q&A session that I did last Saturday, so only 4 days ago, has had 1,700 minutes of viewing only since last Saturday. So obviously there is a demand for people knowing more about Jungian psychology. Maybe people are afraid of going to ask Jungian psychologists because they might want to charge them by the hour. Of course, I have done this as a labor of love for a very long time, so I have no intention of charging people if I can help it. And so maybe there are, I mean, I know as I was reading various Jungian texts, it would have been great if I could have asked somebody questions about it. And it's a bit of hubris on my part to think that I could come online and answer people's questions, but I seem to have been able to do it in our reading group for the last 18 months. And so that gave me a certain amount of confidence that I might be able to give people some direction at least. And Lady Shea asked me if I have any thoughts on the Big Five personality test. And my answer to that is 0. I have no idea. I know I've heard Jordan Peterson mention that measure a few times, but I haven't taken the time to get to know it yet. I have no doubt that it's a useful measure, and there are many others. I remember years ago there was one about how you learn, and I remember taking that test and being a true outlier on experimentation, that I tend to learn by experiment. And that's definitely true. But it's a completely different test from the MBTI, and it's measuring something different. So anyway, I can't say anything about the Big Five personality test. I guess if I understand just from the little bit that I've picked up, I would be a so-called open person in that test, and yet I'm quite an introverted person on the MBTI. So I haven't yet grokked the distinction between the two. But there are many ways of slicing and dicing the psychology, and so I'm not saying anything's wrong with anybody else's method. I'm only saying I'm not familiar with them, unfortunately. I mean, the big trade-off is for someone like Jordan Peterson. He is forced, because he's a university professor, to sort of give equal time to everybody's psychology. And as a result, I think it may pull him off topic. And I think he seems to be strongest in common sense, number one, and number two, in interpreting the Bible. And that's very interesting to me. Let me tell you about my vision of Mephistopheles, since it somehow has been censored here on YouTube. So I'm going to put it into this conversation in the hopes that the story doesn't get censored again. But it'll help you understand why I'm most interested in the religious aspects of Dr. Jung's work and what he was saying. Because, when about 20 years ago, when my number 2 daughter turned 22 years old, now she had been around the world with me several times, and the one place that we really didn't go to was Russia. And so when she went to my alma mater, Hamilton College, she majored in Russian, and she went to a junior year abroad in Russia, and then after graduation she went to Kazan, Tatarstan for a year and a half on a U.S. Information Service scholarship. And she lived with a Muslim woman for that year and a half. And so when she came back, she was 22 years old. And on her birthday, she had done this whole Russia thing without any guidance from me whatsoever, because I would never have sent her to Russia. But anyway, she needed something that was hers, and so she went off to Russia. And when she came back, I took her out to dinner on her birthday, her 22nd birthday, it so happened, at an Afghan restaurant in upper northwest of Washington, D.C. I'm not even sure that restaurant is there anymore, but we were there that particular night, and we were the only patrons. And so we had a lovely, quiet conversation. And at the end of that, and meanwhile, I knew that she was interested in fundamentalist Christianity because she had gotten tied up with a fundamentalism when she was 15. There's an organization called Young Life that tries to capture young people when they're in their mid-teens. And because I had divorced her mother, I wasn't around to offer guidance, and so she went off to this thing. And so she'd become pretty much of a fundamentalist Christian, and when she was in Russia, she got involved with Christian missionaries. And so at the end of this evening at the Afghan restaurant, we came out to the car, and just before she left me, she said, "Well, Dad, I'm sorry to say this to you, but I think you're going to hell." And wow, what a thing to teach young people to say to their parents. I mean, just crazy. But in some sense, my psyche fell into hell at that moment. And I was driving back from Washington to Annapolis, where I now live, and during that car ride, I had a vision that Mephistopheles, the creature that met Dr. Faustus in Faust, in Goethe's Faust, plopped down in the seat next to me in the car. And in that moment, I cut the Faustian bargain with him. And the bargain I cut was that he could have my immortal soul at my death on condition that none of my daughters would ever think that about me for the rest of my life. That was the bargain I cut with Mephistopheles. And, you know, I know that it was a psychogenic experience. I know that it was a vision, but it happened 22 years ago, and I remember it as if it were an actual event. And as soon as we made the bargain, Mephistopheles disappeared. Okay, so I described that once in our reading group, and I put the video on YouTube, and the video is still there. I can still see it in my private account in my creators page, but nobody can get access to that video. So anyway, I thought I'd tell the story again because it sort of provides some of the backdrop for why dreams and visions have been so meaningful to me, because I have had a number of experiences, and that was one of them. As it happens, my daughter and I have very good relations now, and really always have. And so Mephistopheles has kept his part of the bargain. And so okay, so Arcadian Wing says Jung wrote a lot about evil. Did he himself record a personal encounter with evil? In Freud, for instance, that last question doesn't seem to be a complete thought. Is your question, did Dr. Jung feel that Freud was evil? If that's the question, I would say the answer to that is no. Dr. Jung was really quite respectful of Freud throughout his life, and Among other things, you can find his eulogy. If you're on our Dropbox, by the way, you can have access to all of the collected works of C.G. Jung. They're all there in electronic form, and you can download them. And so if you are not yet a member of the Dropbox, you can learn how to become a member. Let me let's see, where's somewhere here I put, it's not that. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so on this first Q&A that I did last Saturday, at 51 minutes and 50 seconds into this video, I do give you information about how to reach our, or how to send me your email address so that I can add you to the Dropbox. What Dropbox does is it creates a virtual folder on your computer, although the data stays in the cloud. And what that allows is that you can read the material in the cloud without downloading the data. And since the volumes of the collected works many of them are 100 megabytes or more, they can't be sent to you by email, but you could download them. You can download them through the internet from Dropbox. And so if you send me your email address to skip.conover@gmail.com, I will be happy to add you to the Dropbox. And thank you for visiting Arcadian Wings. Nice to see you here. Okay, so Lady Shea says, Jerome, if I understand the definitions correctly, my experience is that that's the case with encounters with my animus. I'm not sure I understand the point. Ooh, well, certainly, if Jerome has a response for you on that, I'm more than happy to have him respond, Shea. I am not a psychotherapist, and I really don't want to get into individual psychological issues per se, either in my reading group or in this. My objective through this channel is to help people understand what Dr. Jung was saying. And then it's up to you to decide what it means to you. I'm not trying to analyze anyone, actually. And it's a slippery slope. It's a balance to try to avoid that. I mean, I'm not a psychotherapist, and I really want to try to avoid getting into that. Thank you, Arcadian Wings. That's a good way of putting what quantum physics is. She's saying it shows that the universe is a process of energy taking form and also going out of form, and it doesn't happen randomly, so everything is meaningful information. I think that that's one of the most interesting insights that I've had by studying Jungian psychology, which is to understand that it's all a process. In terms of psychology, it's all a process in our psyche. And so, you know, obviously when we talk about my experience with my daughter and her comment to me that I was going to hell, obviously that affected me very emotionally. And I didn't react to her. I mean, she said, "Well, Dad, I'm sorry to say this, but you're going to hell." And then she hugged me and left for the night, leaving me with this emotional reaction that has really taken me a good 15 years to get under control, because it really threw me back on my own religious experience. And so finally, through the good offices of Dr. Jung and Edward Edinger, and this is Edward Edinger's analysis and commentary on Dr. Jung's work, I understand religion from a psychological point of view, and that has helped me enormously. And certainly, I never thought that, you know, this Mephistopheles vision I had was actually Satan coming up out of the ground and saying something to me. But he was offering me sort of a consolation about how I should deal with my daughters, I think, which came, I know it was psychogenic. It wasn't any out there thing that is evil that's going to come and get me. But obviously those sorts of things, if they come out the wrong way, you know, do lead to lots of nasty things happening around the world. Mr. Aslanov, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Could you please talk a little bit about integrating your shadow? Where should you begin if you want to do it? Well, first of all, the first piece of advice is do it in small doses if possible. And I think what's happened to me is that as I have read Dr. Jung's work, it does feed me my shadow a bit at a time. And I know that anytime I'm feeling bad about anything, any topic, or if I'm depressed, or I'm going through a difficult time in my life, I can pick up any work of Dr. Jung, open it to any page, and somehow it soothes me. And so, in a sense, Dr. Jung has always been my shrink. And and I know that that's true. I mean, it seems weird, I know, because he died when I was 15 years old, but and obviously I never met him, but I certainly, I think one way to do it is to simply read Dr. Jung's work. And I remember when I first ran into Man and His Symbols, and I want to show you the hardbound version of that, which I have on my shelf here. Just pull it off. So sorry. This is the hardbound version, Man and His Symbols. And in this hardbound version, there are many color plates like this one. And so when you're reading the text, of that relate to these color plates, it can be very meaningful. Now, I got this one from Amazon used, and I actually bought 3 for less than $10, but otherwise it's out of print. And meanwhile, they're just selling this paperback version. And the paperback version, the problem with it is all of the plates that are in it, and it doesn't have all the plates, but all the plates are in fairly poor black and white versions to the extent that they're there. They're almost not readable at all. And so, because Dr. Jung, one of his dicta is that we think in images, obviously if the image isn't very good, it's going to be hard to understand. And so I urge you, if you read Man and His Symbols, to read this version. Now, the first time I had a copy of this version, and I've had it 2 or 3 times, it either keeps getting stolen or I lend it to someone or something, and then it's not with me anymore. So I consciously got this one just for me. But when I first got it in 1990, I had been studying the MBTI, of course, and I was in a bookstore and I just came across Man and His Symbols. And so I said, oh, Carl Jung, okay, I guess I'll get that. Or I looked at the flyleaf and it said it was written for laymen. And at that time, I thought Dr. Jung's main work was mainly about the practice of psychotherapy. I did not understand that it was about way more than the practice of psychotherapy. It's really about the history of the development of the mind and the history of the development of religions on a worldwide basis and many other topics. And so, anyway, I bought this book, and for a period of about 1 year, I read 3 or 4 pages of this book every night to my wife before we went to sleep. We'd get into bed, and I'd read 3 or 4 pages, and then I'd put the book aside and we'd go to sleep. And after the year, I felt like I had a year of psychotherapy. And so I highly commend looking at that book. We talked about it at length in the first year of the Jung reading group. So there are probably more than 150 videos in the year 1 playlist that I put on the channel recently where we're discussing it. So one thing you could do is listen to that. And so the issue is, and I mentioned this the other day, I recognize your visit from the other day as well, but the issue with the shadow is the shadow is an important, valuable part of your psyche. It's without it, we're inert as stones, but you have to take it in reasonable doses, and you have to take it when your ego is strong enough to take it. And you build up your ego over a lifetime by what Dr. Edinger called the Job archetype. And the Job archetype is quite simple. There's a contest, a defeat, lamentation over the defeat, and then rebirth. And when you're reborn into something new, then you're disappointed, but you're better able to understand your circumstances and so on, and you go on with something that's more appropriate for your lifetime. And really, Jungian psychology is all about that. And I remember, I think I mentioned this Saturday, but I remember years ago, I heard a James Hillman lecture on tape, and he said, "Can't we find a defeat in here somewhere?" And I didn't understand the comment at this time, but now I do, which is that analysts are always trying to look for where you've been defeated, because that's also the place where you're going to be reborn, or from whence you can be reborn. And the more times you go through that cycle, the stronger your ego is. I don't want to say the bigger your ego, because I don't want to suggest that it's a matter of inflating your ego, but the stronger you are. And so if you pull something up that's bigger than you are, then you need to cut the line. And so that's why the fish metaphor from Christianity comes up, where all of Christ's followers were fishermen, and they were fishers of men. And the idea is that you are pulling something up out of your unconscious from your shadow side, and if it's too big for you to reflect upon in one way or another, and that's what they mean by integration, to be able to reflect upon it and then make it a part of your conscious life where you're aware of it, then if it's too big, you have to cut it loose. And so my example, which I talked about before, was when I had my confrontation with the unconscious, similar to what Dr. Jung had in the Red Book in 1993. It emerged again as a psychogenic vision, but it manifested in a novel, which I basically channeled this novel. I didn't consciously come up with the plot and so on. It just wrote itself, and the psychogenic image of the heroine, who I consider to be my anima at that time, literally dictated the novel to me. I didn't do it from my conscious mind. It just flowed. But one of the aspects of that novel, and it was a novel taking a Japanese farm girl from 15 years old and being sold to pay a debt by her father to age 75 after she's been Prime Minister of Japan. Some parts of that novel are, if we use the more discreet term, erotic. Okay, and that kind of freaked me out, because obviously we all have erotic thoughts from at one time or another, regardless of our sexual orientation, and it was just too much for me. I mean, those scenes did get into the novel, but when I finished it, it took 8 months for this to run through, and literally it was a archetype that had to play through and be all the way to the end. And that's the way archetypes work. But when I got to the end of it, I said, wow, this is a really great novel, but what am I going to do with it? Because I'm in a business career. I can't be associated with this book. and so I put it in my drawer for 21 years. And, finally in 2014, at some point along the way, maybe 10 years earlier, I decided that when I was 70 years old, come what may, I would publish this novel. And so I did that when I was 70. I did make a Kindle version of it, which I put on Amazon. This is not a sales pitch, by the way, because if you're a member of our Dropbox, you can have an electronic copy of all 4 of my books for nothing. Okay, I'm not selling you anything here. but I put that and a book of poetry, which I wrote under the pen name David Garrettson, there as examples of things that can come through your psyche and manifest. And so in terms of then integrating, I mean, obviously that whole novel came out of my shadow, and it was based on lots and lots of things that went back to my high school years in Japan. And then later on, I was in business in Japan for 5 years. I started and operated a subsidiary of an American company in Tokyo for 5 years. And during that time, I had lots and lots of experiences, many. And many of those experiences got into the novel, obviously. Um, and and so those were in my shadow. They were some of them were fairly distasteful experiences, or at least experiences that at the time I didn't think bore the light of day. Now they do, because now I understand them and I've had enough experience so that my ego is not as fragile as it was in 1993. And, you know, if people criticize me for having written this novel, which is actually mild compared to what would actually happen, my ego can respond to their criticism, whereas in 1993 I certainly couldn't have done that. And so you have to use your judgment about what you bring up, because if you bring up something that's bigger than you can handle, you might be in trouble. And Dr. Jung, even at least one point during the Red Book period, thought that he might be going into a psychosis. And, you know, the fortunate thing, the reason we have his good work is that he was a psychiatrist, and so he was able to understand what was happening to him at that time. And when it happened to me in 1993, I had no idea, none, what was happening to me. It just came over me, and I had these visions that in the course of 8 months produced a novel. And then I said, okay, what do I do with this? And it so happened that we had friends, husband and wife, who were psychiatrists at the time, and both of them read the novel, and their comment was that they thought it was a catharsis. Okay, it was somewhat cathartic for me to express out of myself some of these experiences I had, mostly during the time that I was a businessman in Japan. But you know, there's a lot going around in your psyche, and if you understand Dr. Jung's work, even to a minor degree, it can help you keep control when those events occur. You know, I've had many psychogenic visions, waking visions, and of course we all have dreams, I guess. And so now when they happen, I know what they are, and I know how to play along with them. I also know that when I have a dream and I suddenly wake up in a dream and I wish I hadn't awakened because I wanted to go on and find out what happened in the story, I now know that I can go back into the dream consciously, not being asleep, and follow the events further along. My psyche will feed to me a vision of what was happening in the dream. There's a video on the channel called Skip's dream in the sheriff's office, and that's one of those examples where I had a dream and certain things were happening, and I got to an end point in the dream. I woke up, and then I went back into the dream and did the rest of it by active imagination. It was quite interesting. And so there's a description of that in that video, and I'll put a link to that in the recording of this session. Did that address it, Fakri? Is that at all helpful, what I had to say there? I hope so. I'm hoping that, let's see, we still have 8 folks watching, so if there are other people that have questions, I've been going for about an hour and a half now, so, and this is basically a soliloquy, thankfully with the help of your questions. But it seems that there is a demand, because even though we only had, I think at the most on Saturday, 13 people in the session, I saw immediately after that 45 people had been in part of the session, and it's been viewed by over 150 people now. So there obviously is a need and a demand for this kind of discussion, and so I'm happy to try to do them more, but I'd like to do them at a time that's more convenient to people, and I'm not sure when that would be. So if you have thoughts when you see the video come up, which will be shortly after we finish here, please do in the comments section leave a message of encouragement or whatever, but also mention when it would be best to have further Q&As. Okay, Lady Shea wants me to scroll up to Jerome's question. I'm interested too in what you have to respond. I guess maybe I did miss some questions here. Oh my goodness. All right, so Jerome's question: do you think your feeling experience when you're smitten or possessed by the numinous love bug archetype is somewhat similar to an experience of the self? I do not, and having read Ion now, and I'm not sure what I would have answered 2 weeks ago or a month ago, Jerome, but after I've read Ion and had access to this diagram by Dr. Edinger, where this is the self, this lower section, and this is the anima and the animus, through which the self goes into either a male or a female. And it doesn't have to be a gender, male or female. And then here's the ego and the shadow. Okay, so this represents the first 4 chapters of Dr. Jung's book, Ion. And so this is the book I've been reading onto the video the last few weeks. And I've also been reading the Ion lectures. And so basically what Ion does is it talks about the layers of the psyche. And so the layers of the psyche say that the anima and animus ride above the self. And I see what they're talking about, in that the anima is the part of a man which tells you, it's related to the reproductive function, of course, because it says you see a woman and your anima says to you, I really like her. She's perfect for me. and and that's the love at first sight experience. Um, and it's a possession. It can be a possession. And for a woman, it happens with a man. The animus in the woman tells the woman that, that's the man for me. And so it basically is a template for the perfect person from your point of view. Now, where does that template come from? Well, for me, it's long, dark-haired women, and that comes from the fact that when I was a little boy, my mother had long brown hair, and I always had a drawing of her that was done in 1947, so it was, and I think it was from a picture that was taken of her when she was a senior in high school. My father had this drawing done during a deployment in the Mediterranean one time. But that drawing has always been somewhere in my life. It was in my home for the last 25 years, but in the last 2 months I gave it to one of my daughters. But anyway, that, because it's my mother, and my mother was a force of nature by anyone's standards, she basically modeled my anima. And so when I see a woman that meets that characteristic, then I suddenly have this love at first sight experience. It even happened in the Jung group one time, because we have a member, and I have a friend from that who is a psychotherapist. She actually happens to be a sex therapist, and she came to one of her sessions in the early going, and that evening, oh my God, my anima just latched onto her because she had long brown hair, and it was like there was a tunnel of energy passing between her and me, and I couldn't even see the other students in the room, and I kept having to try to break my psyche out of that tunnel so that I could communicate with the other members of the group. And so, but fortunately, I've had enough experiences with this now, and my current wife was like that also. She also had very long brown hair, and so. But I've had enough experiences with it now that I know this is my anima at work, and so I can say, "Oh, slow down there. Hold your horses. Let's get control of this thing before we do something crazy." And obviously, I left my first wife, who had long brown hair, also, to come live with my second wife, and I was with the first wife for 17 years, and now I've been with Debbie for 32 years. So, but just because I got married didn't mean my anima stopped saying, "Hey, this is the woman," and it just always happens. So that's the smitten thing. But I don't think that is the self. The self is a much deeper and even more powerful archetype. And let me just very quickly mention about archetype. My perspective on archetype is that they are instinctual patterns, and they are intended to be a process. And they get constellated. That means that you turn on the record. Think of it as a phonograph record, which you turn on, except you can never turn it off until it's finished playing. And so once an archetype is constellated, it can't be stopped. And so, the most notable example is mother. When a woman becomes a mother, then she's a mother, and there's no stopping it. But the self is what your psyche, the self is going to be about the meaning of your life and what your psyche wants you to be. Now, I'm not saying that that's one thing necessarily. You may end up being frustrated at some point along the line, but it's going to play through. And let me give you the example of the television program The Voice as an example. That's a terrific Job archetype reality program because there's a contest. Most people are defeated. They lament about their defeat, and they go on to be whatever they were intended to be, apparently not a jazz or rock singer. And only a few managed to get to be the very famous ones in that program. But it serves a great role for us because many people have this dream when they're 14 years old of getting a guitar and they're going to go out and be the next rock singer. And the truth is, most of us can't do that. We can't sing or we can't play the guitar well enough or what have you. And so having that contest and defeat early on is the best thing that can happen to you, because then it causes you to lament about it, but then to grow your ego so that you can deal with the next disappointment in your life, and then you're reborn into the next step. And once you've taken enough of those steps, you know what you were meant to be. And so for me, I've taken enough of those steps in my lifetime. I've had lots of successes and lots of failures, but working with Dr. Jung's work for me is a calling, and it's what I was meant to do at this stage based on all of the experience from before that I've had. And so I think that the self is more about the meaning of your life. The anima is about your relation to the opposite function. Let's say if you're a man, your relation to the feminine. It's not only it's not only a love interest or a reproduction interest. It's everything about. For a man, or for me, it's everything about the feminine that's interesting, comes from my anima. But that's not where I live, really. I mean, I live in myself, and that's a deeper thing. And so, anyway, the significance about this is an ion. And the reason I'm doing Edinger as well is in the first 4 chapters I have read into the channel, both Dr. Jung's work and Edinger's, is after his heart attack in 1944, Dr. Jung wasn't going to bring people along on a basic way, like I'm trying to do in this video, let's say. And so he said everybody had to meet him where he was. And so he was 40 years down the pike in terms of his research, and he was writing from where he was. So Dr. Edinger came along and then explained this is what he was driving at. And so it's very helpful to have Edinger's Ion lectures side by side with Ion when you're reading it. But you don't have to physically read it because you can listen to it on the YouTube channel. Okay. So I hope that answered the question. Let me go back. So Arcadia Wings, I vary between INFJ and INFP. Do we know where Jung was on these 4 dimensions? Also feel extremely soothed when I learn about his ideas, also by listening to this channel. Thank you so much, very much. Well, I certainly appreciate that. As far as Dr. Jung, he was clearly He was clearly an introvert because he went off to Bollingen, and I never know whether to pronounce that with a hard or a soft G. Is it Bollingen or Bollingen? I don't know. But anyway, he would go off for weeks at a time to Bollingen, and sometimes Tony Wolff would go out there and be with him, but very often he was there alone, and he was in solitude much of his life, it seems, and did a lot of his writing alone. So he was definitely introverted. He was definitely extremely intuitive, and there's actually in the video interview of Dr. Jung, I forget which one it is, but there is a brief segment on what it's like to live as an IN person. And you can tell that he's really invested in that description, and so am I, because I'm also an IN, and I'm pretty far out on the I scale, but I'm way out there on the intuitive scale. And so he definitely is talking to me in that video. Is he an F or a T? I think he was an F, but I think he could put on the T. He was, he intuited what was necessary to get his ideas across, and so he wrote his books in that way. And he intuited that he was so deep that nobody was going to get it during his lifetime, or very few. I mean, obviously, there was a very small following of Dr. Jung during his lifetime, and he recognized that people wouldn't understand him until humanity itself had matured further. And I think that's very clear. And so he knew that he had to think out what he had to do in his writing, but all of his work about religion and alchemy definitely comes from the F side. And so I really think that he was an F. And he probably was a J. He may very well have been a J, because a J would say, well, this is the details I have to do in my life, so I'm going to do them. And me as a P, I would say, okay, well, I'll do it if I get to it. So in my case, in terms of putting this YouTube channel together, a J would say, okay, these are the things that I have to do day by day to grow my YouTube channel, and I more or less go with the flow. That's what a P does. And so I'm an INTP, so another famous INTP is Einstein. And Einstein, I'm not saying I'm anything like as smart as he was, but Einstein was also known for going to a party without trousers on one time. So we have our flaws and our shortcomings. Colin says I missed some questions. Okay, I think I addressed that one from Jerome. Let's see. I think I covered the smitten question. I covered the 5 personality test, big 5 personality test question. I'm not really seeing any others that I haven't covered. If you're still here, Colin, could you, if you think there's another question that I haven't addressed, let me know. But we're coming up on 2 hours for this session, and I think I should stop at this point. I hope that's answered your question, Arcadian Wings. I hope I answered that. And by the way, I did look up what Arcadian Wings are because I didn't really know, and it's very appropriate because if I understand correctly, Arcadian Wings would be the wings that appear on Mercury's helmet. So the wings of the Psyche, maybe, if I'm understanding it correctly. I was just curious what the symbolism was, so that's why I looked it up. Any other questions? Okay. I did not see a video through WeTransfer, and I'm not sure how I would get it, but you can send me a link to this. Here's my email address in case you didn't write it down for all of you. So if you send me an email and help me understand where to look for it, I will definitely look for it. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up. It's been a 2-hour soliloquy, and so my throat is finally giving out. But thank you all for being here, and I look forward to doing this again in the future, hopefully when it's more convenient for everyone. Okay, so I haven't looked at my email, so I'll definitely look for it. Thank you very much. 2 p.m. Oh, so Jerome thinks 2 p.m. is fine. That's great. And it seems to be working for the people in Europe. I'm not sure about Hawaii, but you can't have everything. So take care. Nice to see you. Thanks for showing up, Will, and identifying yourself. Nice to see you here too. But I'm going to shut it down now. Thank you very much, and we'll do it again very soon.